vacation or I did East Side's VBS. I know I can count on Danny to come here. And the most important thing is I know I can count on Danny to teach the truth. And that's the important thing. I wouldn't trust just anybody to stand before you and proclaim the word if I didn't know they would do the truth, and Danny does. And so Danny's a good man. We appreciate him and his wife, and thankful for them being here tonight and filling in for me so I can go to Patty and do that. We do want to continue to remember our sick, Jim Gann, Etowah Torbett, Chester, Eva Sue Coleman, all them in nursing care. Continue to remember Fanny Henson and Evelyn and Darlene Peel. We have several with cancer: Keisha's Uncle Harper, Harvey Bowers, and Sam Good. And I did get a little bit of an update on Sam, that Joe was talking about it at Patty, the announcements there. He's got a pretty serious form of cancer, and he's doing chemo treatments and seems to be going okay, but the doctors are optimistic that if it goes, and I'm not sure what the level is, but if it has a certain level of success, then they said he will qualify for some kind of program and some kind of treatment in Washington, D.C. And if he can go up there, then there's a better chance they can really help him. But he's got to get through this round of chemo first. So that's an update that they gave at Patty. Surgery in Washington, D.C. The surgery. Okay. So let's continue to pray for all these. Scott Buckner had his gallstones surgery, and Joyce said he's recovering very well from that, so that's good. Drake Watson, Billy Watt's grandson, has a very serious heart condition. Brenda Neal, she is waiting to schedule. They want to do a liver biopsy, is what Steve told me, and so they're waiting to schedule that. She's got to get that done hopefully in the next week or so. Rose again has blood pressure and AFib issues, and she's getting ready to have several tests done. I think she's going to have to wear a heart monitor for a while, and they're supposed to be scheduling that again sometime in the next week or two. So continue to remember all these in the prayers. We appreciate that. Gospel meeting, of course, Patty finishes up tonight at 7. And then remember next week, Sunday through Wednesday, Gateway will be having a gospel meeting. That will also be at 7 o'clock each night. And I was able to get a flyer last night, so it's up on the bulletin board. If you'd like to check that out, but let's try to support them if we can next week in that endeavor. So I'm going to turn it over to Brother Cheryl. John has our opening prayer, and at the appropriate time, Lane will have our dismissal prayer.
Good evening, everybody. Please get your song book and turn to number 580. This is my Father's world, and to my listening ear, all nature sings and round thee ring the music of the Spirit. This is my Father's. I'm resting in the thought of rocks and trees, of skies and seas. His hands the wonders song. This is my Father, the mercy, the morning light, the lily, declare the Maker. This is my Father, he shines in all that. In the rustling grass, I hear him fight. He speaks to me everywhere. This is my Father's word. Oh, let me never forget that though the seas all so strong, God is the ruler. This is my Father's heart. The man is mine. Jesus who died shall be satisfied, and earth and heaven be one. Please put your markers at number 226. Number 226 will be the Psalm reading. They're lying in this. Okay. That's good.
Yeah, turn on. Check and see what turn on.
Have we got a knob there if you want to turn it down?
Little knob on the top.
And working over. I just didn't know how to work it.
Didn't hold your mouth the right way.
Yeah, that's the problem. I didn't know what to think when I walked in the market here. I thought, maybe I got the dates mixed up. Maybe I'm here on the wrong night. But I do that every once in a while. Get things mixed up. Well, it's good to see you here tonight. And I have to tell you, although I won't be running any marathons here in the near future, I do feel better than I did Sunday. I had a unique combination Sunday. I'm a diabetic, and I never know when it's going to rear its ugly head. So Sunday morning, my glucose dropped out of sight, and by the end of the lesson, Sunday morning lesson, I was feeling pretty weak. Plus, I had a little accident a few weeks ago. My 90-pound dog body slammed me out at the vet's office, and I'm still recovering from that. Still a little bit sore, but I am recovering, and I will recover. If you would, turn with me to our text for this evening, which is Romans chapter 1, and I'll be reading verses 24 through 32. Romans 1, verses 24 through 32. There Paul wrote, therefore God also gave him up to uncleanness in the lust of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for the lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to vile passions, for even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another, men with men, committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error, which was due. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind, to do those things which are not fitting. For being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, even evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, who knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. A pivotal phrase found 3 times in our text for tonight is God gave them over. Both the King James Version and the New King James Version have God gave them up in verses 24 and 26, and God gave them over in verse 28. But the Greek for gave over and gave up is the same. Understand these verses 24 through 32. We need to grasp the full implication of these alarming words. God gave them over. Each time this phrase appears, we're given the reason that God gave them over. In verses 22 and 23, we're told that people became so foolish that they exchanged the glory of the corruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds and 4-footed animals and crawling creatures. Verse 24 then says, therefore God gave them over. In verse 25, it said that the Gentiles exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator. Then in verse 26, it begins, for this reason, God gave them over. In verse 28, Paul wrote, and just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over. In all 3 of these statements, that which motivated God to give over mankind was his stubborn refusal to acknowledge him as God, which resulted in idolatry. Well, this begs the question, what exactly did Paul mean when he said God gave them over? What did God do when he gave them over? This Greek phrase means to hand over or deliver up. It's used in the story of the cross in referring to the handing over of Jesus to Pilate for trial and then to the Roman soldiers for execution. Now, some people might think that this means that God no longer had an interest in them, that he no longer cared about them. But when God gave sinners over, he was still concerned. He still hoped that they would return to him. One translation has, God let go of them. What then did Paul mean when he said, God gave them over? That is, God handed them over. God delivered them up, or God let go of them. Most commentators arrive at the same conclusion. Instead of restraining mankind in its downward spiral, God let people do as they wish. One translation has, God let them go ahead and do whatever shameful things their hearts desire. Further, instead of protecting people from the consequences of their actions, God allowed them to suffer the full penalties of their chosen lifestyles. One commentator wrote, if you decide to depart from God, He's not going to send a legion of angels to stop you. It will break His heart, but He will let you go. Another commentator expressed the message of Romans 1:24 this way. So God said, in effect, if that's what you really want, that is what you will get. In the parable of the prodigal son, the father didn't want his younger son to leave home. Still, he let him go, though he knew the boy was headed for tragedy. To use Paul's terminology, the father gave him over to the son's selfish desires and allowed him to travel the path that led to the pig pen. All the while, though, the father hoped that his son would come to his senses and return home. So mankind might have been God abandoned, but he was not God forsaken. Even though sin separates a person from God, Isaiah 59 verses 1 and 2, the sinner is never totally forsaken by God in this life. This sinful world doesn't really realize how dependent it is on the daily expressions of God's grace and mercy, just for daily survival, which God continues to provide, regardless. Matthew 5, verses 44, verse 45. If, however, we remain impenitent until death, we will be God forsaken throughout eternity. C.S. Lewis was right when he wrote that the lost will enjoy forever the horrible freedom they have demanded. The Apostle Paul then gave two examples of how depraved humans become once God gives them over to do whatever they wish. The first example is a specific kind of sin, immorality, which Paul discusses in verses 24 through 27. The second example is more general in nature and might be thought of as general iniquity in verses 28 through 32. After discussing idols in verses 22 and 23, Paul said in verse 24, therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness in the lust of their hearts to dishonor their bodies among themselves. The word translated lust refers to strong desires. Usually, as used in Scripture, it means evil desires. In this verse, Paul was speaking of a strong desire for impurity. The word translated impurity basically means uncleanness. This uncleanness can be physical, it can be ceremonial, or it can be moral. The context of this verse indicates that Paul had in mind moral uncleanness of a specific kind. One translation has sexual impurity. Now, when men depart from God, they throw off all moral restraints. Among the symptoms of a decadent society are 1, increased sexual permissiveness, 2, a demand for sexual freedom, and followed by 3, widespread sexual promiscuity. It's been said that in Rome, the pursuit of personal passion ruled as king. Notice that verse 24 is preceded by a passage on making idols, verse 23, and is followed by a verse on worshiping idols, verse 25. It's no coincidence that this passage on sexual immorality is found between two verses on idolatry. Pagan temples were notorious for their temple prostitutes, both men and women, who would engage in any type of sexual perversion for a price. Sexual immorality was rampant among idol worshippers, not only in their temple worship, but also in their day-to-day life. Paul then wrote another line on idolatry, and then gave a specific example of the sinful sexual depths reached by society. In verses 26 and 27, he said, "For this reason, God gave them up to vile passions, for even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another, men with men committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error, which was due." Now, most of us have no trouble recognizing the sin that Paul describes here. This is one of the clearest and strongest treatments and condemnation of homosexuality in the Bible. Homosexuality. Sex with a person of the same gender. This can, in contrast to heterosexuality, which refers to sex between a male and a female. Now, some deny that Paul was talking about homosexuality in verses 26 and 27, but it's hard to see how he could have been more clear. Women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural, and men burned in their desire toward one another, men with men committing indecent acts. One translation has this: women no longer wanted to have sex in the natural way. Men behaved in the same way. They wanted to stop having sex with women and had strong desires for sex with other men. Not only is it obvious that Romans 1:26 and 27 is discussing homosexuality, but it's also obvious that such is contrary to God's will. First, Paul said that homosexuality is the result of degrading passions. The word for passions is always used in a bad sense in the New Testament. The word translated degrading means dishonorable or shameful. Then, Paul referred to homosexuality as unnatural. This is not the judgment of some narrow-minded preacher, but the inspired declaration of an apostle of the Lord. Unnatural. It literally means against nature. One translation has as its meaning unnatural and abnormal. Now, sin in general had lowered mankind to the level of animals. But homosexuality went further. It took humans even lower than the animals. I grew up on a small farm. My dad had cows, he had chickens, and he had hogs. But I never, growing up on that farm, saw a cow showing affection for another cow. Nor did I ever see roosters that were trying to mate. they were above the level of human beings because they stuck to the opposite sex. Then Paul said that lesbians exchanged a natural function for what is unnatural. The Greek word for exchange is the same that was found in verse 23, which said that mankind had exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image. Men had made a bad trade when they gave up God for idols. But now Paul says that women had made a tragic trade by exchanging natural relations with men for unnatural relations with other women. Then Paul made this statement in verse 28, and using another God gave him over statement to add to the list. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things which are not proper. Now, this statement is so pivotal, we need to look at it one phrase at a time. They did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer. Their unbelief was a deliberate and calculated act. The authors of one commentary wrote, humans sat in judgment on God to decide whether he fit the qualifications of a God that would be to their liking. And they decided he did not meet those qualifications, and he was dismissed from their lives. When people rejected God, he gave them over. But notice that God never abandoned anybody until they abandoned him. He gave them over to a depraved mind. The word depraved refers to that which is unapproved, that which fails the test. One commentator suggested this translation: since they did not see fit to retain the knowledge of God, he gave them over to an unfit mind. Another commentator said, they did not approve to know God, and thus they came to have an unimproved mind. The minds of those who rejected God minds of those who rejected God, can't get my notes fixed. Again, speaking of minds of those who rejected God, became incapable of making trustworthy moral judgments. In other words, they could no longer even tell right from wrong. Now, it's little wonder that those in the world cannot understand our concern regarding lower moral standards. And sometimes they label us as crazy or narrow-minded when we oppose things such as abortion or homosexuality. But according to Paul, their minds are the ones that are messed up. A wrong decision led to wrong thinking, which in turn led to wrong living. They begin to do those things which are not proper. In other words, things that were not appropriate. When mankind did not see fit to acknowledge God, there was no curb to its ungodliness. There was no limit to its depravity. Pauline illustrated man's depravity with a catalog list of more than 20 sins. Now, he didn't list every sin of his day, but he did list typical sins. We're not going to define all these sins, since they're sins that we're pretty much all familiar with. And not everyone in Paul's day was guilty of every sin mentioned, but they were guilty of one or more of these sins. As we name each of the listed sins, we will no doubt even find ourselves indicted to some degree. In verses 29 through 31, Paul said, being filled with all righteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful. All of us presented this catalog of typical sins in his day. It's a heartbreaking list that describes the total breakdown of the human community as standards completely disappear and society disintegrates. Assuming that Paul was writing this letter from Corinth, he had only to look out the window to see examples of every vice that he had named. However, do we not also have to do more than look to see the very same examples of sin in our world today? We are in an ever-increasing pace to capture the very same abominable style of living that the people of Paul's day had captured. We look around and we see the same things going on that Paul talked about. That list was finished, but Paul had two more comments to make before he completed this part of his letter. He wrote in verse 32, who, knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. First are these surprising words. They know the judgments of God. They know that those who practice such things are worthy of death. Paul was returning to the thought that these sinners did not act out of ignorance. These evildoers may not have understood all the implications of the wrongs they were doing, but deep inside, they knew that what they were doing was not right. What does it mean when it says that they know that those who practice such things are worthy of death? They knew what they were doing was wrong and deserved punishment, whether temporary or eternal. But that was not the climax of their rebellion. Paul concluded in verse 32, they not only do the same, but also give approval to those who practice them. Give approval. That is to think well of. That is approve. But it has a much stronger implication. One translation has approve and applaud. their downward journey was complete. First, they didn't want to know the God. Thus, their minds degenerated and their lives became filled with all unrighteousness. They became so hardened that they were indifferent to God's warnings. Finally, saddest of all, they not only sinned, but they also encouraged others to do the same. Again, such a striking similarity to what is happening in the world today. This is the reason we have politicians applauding gay, lesbian, and transgender lifestyles. And this is the reason we see Pride Month in our nation as we are having pushed down our throats in TV advertisements, events, and other things. The world is standing up and it's approving evil. Does anyone have a comment or question at this time? One thing that people have in common that are not in fellowship with God is sin. I talked about a lot of sins in this lesson, but sin is sin. And sin will condemn us if we're not ready to repent and return to God. This evening, if you're in that situation, if you have things in your life that are public, that need to be repented of, and you have the opportunity to confess these things to your brethren and request the prayers of all of us. If you're subject in any way to the Lord's invitation, won't you come as we stand and sing?
Have thy afflictions been nailed to the cross? Is thy heart right with God? Dost thou count all things for Jesus the Lord? Is thy heart right with God? Is thy heart right with God? Washed in the crimson blood, cleansing made holy, humble and lowly, right in the sight of God. Hath thy dominion sin? Is thy heart right with God? Over all evil without ending. Is thy heart right with God? Is thy heart right with God? Washed in the crimson blood, cleansed and made holy, humble and lowly, right in the sight of God. Are all thy powers under Jesus' control? Is thy heart right with God? Does he each moment abide in thy soul? Is thy heart right with God? Is thy heart right with God? Washed in the crimson blood, cleansed and made holy, humble and lowly, right in the sight of God. Thanks, thank Brother Danny for another good lesson tonight. And always take heed. And this old world, this old ball of bud that we live on, it's in a bad place. We need to always remember those on our prior list. And remember services Sunday morning, the Bible study at 9:30, regular services 10:30.